It's no reason to become alarmed, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your flight. By the way, is there anyone on board who knows how to fly a plane?
Welcome to Avoiding Real Estate Turbulence. This is your pilot, John Lafferty with Century 21 Town & Country.
And your co-pilot, Tony Abate with Ross Mortgage. And we are your real estate pilots. Our job is to be your real estate advocate and also make sure you're educated about the buying process. We'll keep you informed throughout until we get you safely closed.
Yeah, I know what you meant. In a real estate purchase, there are many reasons the sale can encounter turbulence. Today, we are going to discuss a few of these bumps that can occur with the seller's disclosure.
Yeah, John, this is a good topic, and as the lender, this is something that kind of comes into our world after the fact, and so we're not involved in the Q&A of what a seller has to go through when they complete it, and we're not involved in the discussion when a purchaser reviews that seller's disclosure and how that affects their buying decision. So, talk a little bit about that, if you would, and how you discuss that with buyers and sellers.
Sure. When I sit down with a seller and go through the seller's disclosure with them, there's always questions that come up. What do I check here? What are they asking here? The questions on there are pretty straightforward, but there's always questions about what exactly it's looking for. And in the end, really what it's just looking for is information, disclosure to provide to a buyer so that they're going to make an informed decision. And really and truly, what a seller's disclosure is going to offer to a buyer is any defects in the property, functionality of items, and encroachments. It's basically what it boils down to. So let's talk about defects. Does the basement leak? Does the backyard flood? Is there problems with plumbing? Those are some defects. Functionality. Is the roof solid? Does it leak? Does the electric panel work? Is the furnace functional? And when we talk about encroachments, and a couple of examples of that would be, is the home near a landfill, railroad tracks? Is it part of a homeowners association and there's common areas, or you share fences in common with neighbors? So those are some of the things that you're kind of disclosing to a buyer to give them information. And there's other things on there as well, whether or not appliances work and what a home has and doesn't have, if it's a septic or sewer system or well water or community or it's connected to city water. So those are things I think that are important. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this today, Tony, was because I had posted something and I had a friend. This was not through Facebook. So he posted something and he said, "Hey, that's great that you have to disclose that a house has an aggressive spirit living there." I guess is no better way to describe a ghost, I guess, if you want to call it that. So it's a law in New York State that if a seller is aware that a home has an angry spirit or a ghost living in the residence, that you have to disclose that. It's state law.
Wow.
And we started talking, and he started asking me about Michigan. And I said, well, Michigan, we don't have to do that. That is not something that's on our seller's disclosure. It's not something that has to be disclosed.
No ghost law. Huh? Yeah.
No ghost law. And just to sort of go along with that, in California, if somebody's died in the home within the last 3 years, that has to be disclosed up front. You have to be you have to make a buyer aware of that. In Michigan, we don't have to do that.
Wow.
It's not something that they have to disclose. Now, of course, the caveat to that is, if asked, a seller must disclose if they have knowledge that someone passed away in the home, someone was murdered in the home. You have to disclose that. And same thing goes with the listing agent. If the listing agent is aware of that and is asked, they must disclose. What happens if they don't? They're liable. They could be sued for that. Yeah. So that's important information. And I I feel like the reason for that is because if something horrific happened in a house, a murder, a suicide, something along those lines, it can have a detriment on the value of the home.
Sure.
Public perception of that home as, geez, let's go back to the Manson murders, right? That home was bulldozed and destroyed because there was such a stigma attached with that home because of what happened there. That home was always associated with that horrific event that happened there. So it doesn't exist anymore. That home does not exist. And so in this instance as well, if people really have an aversion to living in a home where somebody passed away, which some people do. Some people don't care. It's no big deal. As long as somebody passed away peacefully, they don't have an issue with it. But some people do. Yeah. And so it's something that if you want to know that, you have your realtor ask or you ask the seller yourself. Yeah. It's something that I think you should know if it's something that's concerning to you.
Interesting. Yeah. All these things, it's all about putting all the cards on the table, isn't it? Just to make sure that people know what's up. But I think, talk a little bit about, if you would, a seller's disclosure is just that. It is the seller's representation of what's going on. And, is a buyer safe in looking at a seller's disclosure and saying, all right, based on what I'm seeing here, I'm going to forego the inspection? I don't think that's probably a fair conclusion for a buyer, right? Okay.
No.
Yeah. Talk about that, if you would.
Sure. So, you're right. The seller's disclosure is just that. It's a seller's representation of what's going on with the house. But these are all things that a seller learns over time. So, yeah, he knows that in a heavy downpour, there's a trickle in the basement of water. He's going to disclose that. However, he may not have, in his wisdom, figured out that the reason why in a heavy downpour it's doing that is, this part of the driveway is slanted towards the house. There's no sealant between the house and the driveway, and so in a heavy downpour, it just pools there, and then the water finds a way down. Well, what an inspector is going to do is going to walk around the exterior of the house and the interior of the house, and they're going to be able to tell you, okay, so this is where the water's coming in, and here's my conclusion as to why. So the solution may be as simple as sealing that concrete towards the house, or it could be something as major as the way this driveway is slanted towards the house. It's only going to get worse. Yeah. You've got a problem. You've got erosion of the soil underneath the concrete pads, and as we continue to go month after month, year after year, it's only going to slant more, and you're only going to end up with more of a problem. Right. Now, Mr. Buyer, you've got a decision to make. Do you continue to move forward and buy the house with the idea that eventually you're going to have to maybe replace a few pads of the driveway, or have a concrete company come out, maybe jack them up, level them out? Yeah. It's still a cost, but you make an informed decision at that point. So I never tell buyer to forego an inspection because there's so much to learn in a buyer inspection. The seller's disclosure is really a tool. It's a tool to use in order to move forward with an inspection. So you kind of know some of the defects, but then you can also learn other things as you go along. Yeah. So it's maybe guide, but not gospel as far as what's going on with that property. And, right. in hearing you talk about that, if I were in a buyer's shoes right now, and I hired that inspector to go through that home, I think I'd have that seller's disclosure in hand. So I could say, Mr. Inspector, tell me what you think about what the seller marked here. Is it a major issue? Is it a minor issue? Does he know what he's talking about? Or where do we go from here? Yeah, that's exactly right. And the good inspectors, I'm at every inspection. It's important, I feel, for the buyer's realtor to be at the inspection with the inspector walking around, because you get it firsthand from the inspector and you can have a dialogue with them. Yeah. There are inspectors out there who will say, this is wrong with the heater, and this is wrong with the hot water heater, and this is wrong with this. And to read that on a piece of paper, you'd say to yourself, ooh, That might sound serious. Yeah. But in talking with the inspector, okay, what does that really mean? So what are you saying here? So, so you're saying this. Okay, so it's a simple fix like this. Yep. It's very simple. Got it. Okay. That doesn't sound like a major item. Right. And so and also in having a dialogue with the inspectors, a lot of the things that I bring up right at the very beginning is, okay, so according to the seller's disclosure, there is an issue that they had with the roof. So when you get up in the attic, you might want to check over by the chimney. There was an issue with the flashing that they say they fixed. So maybe you want to just check, make sure there's no mold there, make sure that the leak isn't active anymore. Maybe there's some old staining there, but just to guide them so that they kind of are aware of what they may be looking for with things that the seller has disclosed.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, inspectors are human too, and so they're gonna go through their checklist and go through the motions. But if you can tip them off to something that is a concern that was legitimately brought forth by the seller, then maybe they can spend a little extra time, or maybe give that purchaser some peace of mind and say, "This is what the seller is talking about, and this is what it looks like they did to cure it. You're fine," or budget for this and be concerned about that, et cetera. Is that a fair way to look at it?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly how you look at it. You're putting this together in your head as you're going through the inspection. And one of the things that I never do with home inspectors play gotcha. Let them go to some areas and say, I'm going to see if they can find where that water intrusion happened according to the seller's disclosure. And then if they don't find it, hey, you didn't do a good enough. No, that's not. You're all part of a team, and the whole point of a team is to avoid turbulence. And part of that is working together to find things to give the buyer the most information that they can to make an informed decision. Do I want to move forward with this purchase or not? And if I do, here's what I need to negotiate. Here's what I want the seller to take care of or give me a credit for, however we want to move forward. Right. Having all that information is really important to make an informed decision.
Yeah. That's good advice. I think that inspections, they're not free. They do cost money. People have to budget time to do that. And I can see where a less than informed purchaser might say, why do I need to do that? The seller has told me everything that I need to know. But it's just what the seller is saying. And goodness, if he has a vision problem, he may not see any of the defects, and he completes a clean seller's disclosure. It doesn't mean the defects aren't there. So,
absolutely. Yeah. One of the things that I've come across. Did I say across?
Across, yeah.
Across. That's not a word. Across. In the last 3-4 years, it's been a little more common than I think it should be, and that's you have an investor who owns a home or an absentee owner who's maybe moved away because they've been relocated, and so the tendency is to not fill out a seller's disclosure, just scratch a line through it and say, owner doesn't live here. Right, owner never lived here as an investor or owner. And those are not legitimate reasons not to fill out a seller's disclosure. I will just tell you that, Mr. Buyer or Mrs. Buyer who are out there listening, it is not a legitimate reason to not fill out a seller's disclosure. However, I will also tell you that because of the market that we're in, you as a buyer have a choice to make. Do I accept that and just rely on the inspection? Or do I really put my foot down and say, I will not buy this house unless you provide me with a seller's disclosure filled out to the best of your knowledge, Mr. Investor, Mrs. Investor, Mr. and Mrs. Owner who haven't lived here for 20 years, you still know the repairs that have had to been made to the home because you're being billed for them. You still know if a newer furnace went in there 15 years ago. Yeah. You still know if a basement has had water issues because your tenant is calling and screaming about it, either to you or to the property management company. Why aren't you disclosing this information? Either A, because you're too lazy, or B, because you're afraid to disclose it and you're going to hide behind the line through the seller's disclosure. Now, don't get me wrong. There's legitimate reasons to not have to fill out, and they're protected by law. And it's probate courts, it's trusts, it's estates. There's exemptions for those. A foreclosed home, they're exempt from disclosing those things. A government entity, I should say, is exempt from disclosing those. So there are legitimate reasons for for a seller's disclosure not being provided. But a home that's a quick flip.
Mm-hmm.
You know what you've done to that house. You know what you've fixed. You know what you've put into that home. Just because you didn't live in it, that's not the threshold.
Yeah.
You've owned that home. You've fixed it up. You need to fill that out. And so, again, it's a tough thing right now because if you're a buyer, do you put your foot down and say, I'm not buying this home unless I get one? And they say, okay, fine, we'll move on. We'll find another buyer.
Yeah.
Not going to fill one out.
That's a good point. Yeah. And I would think that if a seller wanted to put his best foot forward, even if he did own it as an investment and never lived there, he could probably legitimately straddle the fence and maybe build some confidence in the transaction. I never lived here. However, here's what I know. Here's when I replaced the roof. Here's when I did this. This is what I know. So again, all the cards are on the table. The seller is saying what he knows. I'd have to think that number one, it puts the seller in the right light and hopefully makes the purchaser be a little more confident too.
Agree 100%. Yeah. When in doubt, disclose.
Sure.
Live by that, and so unfortunately, there's quite a few listing agents out there that don't.
Yeah.
You don't want to fill it out? No issues. Hey, wait, you're an investor? We're just going to draw a line through that for you, pal. You don't have to fill that out. Yeah, it's not the right way to do it.
Interesting.
And but you see quite a bit of it simply because of the market that we're in.
Yeah. I see what you're saying, and I've never really put it in that context. When we get it on the lender side, we assume just that they never lived there. We're done. But from the buyer-seller perspective, it's different. They do have the right to know whatever the seller is aware of.
Yep. And obviously, if they decide to move forward without that, that's their decision to make and accept that and just rely on the inspection.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I've always been interested in is whether or not a seller's disclosure is checked on the purchase agreement as being part of the purchase agreement. A lender still requires to see it.
Yeah.
I'm curious. What's a lender looking for in that seller's disclosure? What's the red flags that a lender's going to say, whoa, slow the train here. We need further information on this, or this is a no-go based on what's here. Yeah. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a fair question. What folks will often say is, this has nothing to do with the loan. Why is the lender sticking their nose in this? And we are a nosy lot. I will admit that, because we got a lot at stake. But here's the rationale behind that. It's a required disclosure, so we know it's out there. And the idea is, if there's something that is material that a lender could or should know about it, we should at least do our due diligence. We take it in the context for just what we were talking about. It's just the seller's representation. But if the seller's disclosure says every April and May I'm wet dry vacuuming 3 inches of water out of the basement, we can't unsee that. It's got to be addressed. But it's really an effort of the lender doing appropriate due diligence. Pre-recession, we never asked for those as a rule. Pre-recession, conventional appraisals didn't have interior photos either. And so there's just, the message is heard loud and clear. Lenders, you got to be more careful. And so it falls into that category of, if we know it's there, if we know it might have some material information, it behooves us to take a look at it.
All right. So in that vein, you get the pictures back for an appraisal. You've already looked at the seller's disclosure statement. You get the pictures back from the appraisal. In some of those pictures are holes in the ceiling from whatever that just haven't been patched. Let's say the home has a new roof, but the holes in the ceilings haven't been patched. Okay. So that buyer's got work to do. They're fully aware of it. They've seen it. They know what they got on their plate. And let's say there's some broken windows. Maybe the first pane or the inside pane or the outside pane, but not both panes are broken. So it's still a functional window. It's just got a big crack in it. Still okay? Or are we getting into Now it kind of depends on how much money they're putting down for the loan. If they're doing a 3% down payment, is this an issue versus a 20% down payment?
Yeah, that's a good point. Logically, that should make a big difference. The lender's got a bigger equity stake. There's less risk. We can, not maybe have our eyes quite as wide open. But the reality is that the property has to meet certain standards regardless of that buyer's down payment. And you do get into, where are we at on the continuum of things with regard to crossing that line between something being a cosmetic flaw versus something that is a bona fide structural or safety or soundness defect. So speaking to things like what you were mentioning, if you have a cracked window pane, that's probably going to be left alone. It's not, the window itself is not going to fall out of the frame because of a fracture like that. The holes in the ceiling, you've got a different issue. Now we're talking structural things. You're certainly talking about marketable impact on those kind of things. And so lenders have to make a decision. It's not always black and white, but I guess the bottom line, going back to your question, is that if things are visible in the photos and they are irregular or unorthodox, lenders obligated to call them out. And at a minimum, maybe get some further explanation or further documentation as to what's going on.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not black and white.
No. And interesting thing, John, people used to say, well, we can't take this property FHA because there's water in the basement. Well, you can't take it really with any financing except renovation financing. And it's not there was a mindset, I think, for a while that FHA was requiring, properties with very, very few repairs, and conventional just turned a blind eye. And that's not the case. It's got to be adequate collateral for the loan.
Okay. So let's take this a little further along, and we get through the inspection. Mm-hmm. The buyer and seller have agreed to repairs, mm-hmm. and it's in the form of a credit. So obviously the lender has to see it mm-hmm. because they need to have it on the closing disclosure for closing, for what you have to disclose to both sides. How much information should be on that addendum before it becomes a red flag for the lender and they put the brakes on and say, whoa. Oh, this needs to be done before we fund this loan.
Right. Well, let's deal with the elephant in the room, shall we? So an inspection is done, and an addendum comes to us that says, buyer is satisfied with the inspection. Seller agrees to provide a $2,000 credit towards closing costs at the time of closing. And those are factual statements, and we can move on based just on that. And
not a red flag for a lender at this point.
It is not a red flag. It really isn't. However, if the same flow happens and the addendum says, buyer is satisfied with the inspection, however, the seller must credit $2,000 to take care of the cracked heat exchanger, the mold that's in the corner, the leaky pipes under the sink. Then the lender has to say, you know what, we can't unsee this. Now we've got to know that these material defects are taken care of. It's irresponsible for us to turn a blind eye on it. And so, we never want to do anything that is fraudulent, but by the same token, we need to be mindful as to what's on the addendum, because we've got to complete that circle. If there's a defect, before we close that loan, we got to know the defect is taken care of. If somebody is simply asking for $2,000 to cover their costs, then we acknowledge that and we move on.
Talk a little bit about some of the things you can do to get around some issues. Mm-hmm. For instance, you and I had a deal several years ago. Mm-hmm. The front door, the frame was basically junked. There was basically nothing left holding this door open except pins and needles. Yeah. And talk about escrow accounts and mm-hmm. how those might be a workaround for something that a seller isn't going to fix before closing, but we can still go ahead and close.
Right. So the best thing that can happen is that both sides are in agreement as to what the cure is. When you have a situation like that, and the seller says, "Well, I acknowledge the defect. I'm willing to take care of it, but my money's tied up in the home. It needs to happen after the fact." And then, to your point, an escrow is set up, and that money is set off to the side. The repair is done after the closing. Lenders are not happy about doing that. I'll just put it that way. And there's a couple situations. If this is an FHA finance transaction and, for instance, repairs can't be done because of a weather-related delay, maybe it can't paint their poor concrete because it's January and it's exterior work, money can legitimately put outside for that. But short of that, escrows are generally only going to be allowed if you have something that falls into that category of a cosmetic agreeable repair. A circumstance like that could be a tough escrow to get passed because it speaks to the structural integrity of the home. But if it's an agreement to replace a worn countertop or something like that, if it's a quick repair where that escrow can disperse quickly after the closing for the repair, many lenders will encourage that, but it becomes risky because, if you have a default on a loan and there's repairs that didn't get done, then the lender has to take care of those repairs before they can sell that property through the foreclosure process. So they're not quick to do the escrows. We're not quick to do the escrows.
Correct. But you did do it in that instance.
We did do it, yeah.
And work got done.
Yeah, and I would say in that case, it was probably determined that was cosmetic in nature, and no harm, no foul. It all depends on how bad it is. But, it's a lender decision on that kind of a thing.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Do you ever see a point where a lender's going to require a copy of a buyer's inspection report? And is it already happening?
We have not experienced that. There's inspectors are not licensed, right? Anyone can do an inspection, and what's coming out of that inspection is not something that is governed or mandated or anything like that. Now, if there's a known defect or a perceived defect, and there's data on the inspection that can validate that it's really not a defect or it's not a severe thing, then the inspection can help keep the process moving forward. But I really, when you get into inspections, you're talking about quality. When you're talking about appraisals, you're talking about quantitative things and minimum property standards. I would say that's probably a section of the transaction that we as lenders are best left out of that. Have you run into lenders that are requiring them?
I have had a few lenders who have said to the buyers, my buyers, we would like a copy of your inspection report. And so we've done the inspection. They get the report and they're saying, okay, John, so blah, 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 blah. And we're going to do this and we're going to ask the seller for this. And then I'm going to upload it and send it to my lender. Whoa, 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 whoa. What are you doing? No. Yeah. No, do not give that report to your lender. Right. They didn't pay for it. It's yours. They don't need to see a copy of it. Mm-hmm. That's for you and you alone. So a lot of these, some of these lenders are just trying to say, hey, we'd love to see a copy of it just for our file if you don't mind. No harm, no foul. But, they're looking for something. Yeah. So
that's a shame, that's outside of our purview, I would argue, as a lender.
I would argue that too.
Yeah.
I would agree with you.
And good for you for fighting on behalf of the buyer to say, you know what, tap the brakes on that.
Look, purchases are hard enough. Why do you want to add more turbulence to a purchase when it doesn't need to be there? One last thing I wanted to just cover real quick. So you mentioned things that are known defects. There are certain areas of southeastern Michigan that have more incidences of radon than others. You foresee a day coming in the near future where lenders may say, oh, that's in this community, we're going to require a radon test and we want to see the results of that before we move forward. Do you foresee something like that happening? Or let's use arsenic in well water in certain areas of Macomb County. It's more common than not, and in Oakland County. So do you foresee anything like that coming down the pipe?
This is Tony talking. I'm not, this is just my opinion and not speaking on behalf of the industry or anything, but I would say localize that. Yes, that absolutely can happen. And our industry ebbs and flows with that sort of thing. And I'll give you an example. When the terribly unfortunate situation happened in Flint, where their water supply was compromised when the source was changed, then as lenders, we needed to require water tests on those properties where we would otherwise not know that there was a problem. So, if there's a known issue and it can affect marketability or safety of homes, we're going to need to take a look at that. And so if there's a ramp up in incidences where there's radon evidence or arsenic in water, then yeah, it's the prudent thing to do where we would be testing for that.
Now that makes sense. Mm-hmm. But again, buyers, don't give your inspection report to the lenders.
No,
don't
we don't
do
want
it.
That. No. We have plenty to review. Yeah.
All right. Well, that's going to wrap it up for today. Thanks so much for listening.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to Avoiding Real Estate Turbulence. If you would be so kind to subscribe to our podcast, review, and rate it, we would appreciate that. Please share it with your friends, family, and coworkers that they can find us on iTunes Store, Google Play, and SoundCloud. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.